Hi folks, welcome to another Intro to HTML video. In this video, we're going to start making things really interesting. That's not to say that the previous videos haven't been interesting. I think they kind of have been. But the material that we're going to cover today is going to open the door for all kinds of things as far as positioning goes. So far, all we've been able to do is put our content in the page and let it flow wherever it flows. We stack things up in a vertical stack. The taller they get, the longer they get in the browser, and we don't have any control as to how wide the content is, how tall it is, whether or not it sits side by side. All we can control really is just we put things in there and it flows along with the rules of the browser. The box model is a way of controlling placement of elements within the browser. The box model says that every single element in HTML is based on a box. It's got a box around it. I can demonstrate this with a simple statement. I'm going to go to that page that we made in a previous video where we had a table, we had some articles, we had a nav, we had a header with an H1, all that kind of stuff. We've seen this one before. I'm just going to launch it in the browser. This is what it was. Okay, you might remember this. I'm going to add one statement so that you can see what those boxes really look like. You'll probably never do this in an actual page, and if you do, you're crazy. Border, one pixel solid black. The star is the universal selector or the wildcard, and what it's going to do is select every single element in the HTML document. So what I'm doing is saying that every element is going to get a border. That's going to help us visualize all these boxes. Launch it. Now you can see all these borders. Every single HTML element has a box around it. My H1 has this box around it here. That's my H1. My header has this box around it here. My body has a box around it. My H2 has a box. The nav, the ULs, or pardon me, the links all have a box around them. The table has a box around it. All of the elements in the table, the caption, the T head, the T foot, the T body, the TDs, the THs, they all have boxes. Paragraphs have boxes. That's the idea, the basis of the box model, that every single element in an HTML document has a box around it. And we can use that box to control where it goes in the document. I'm going to change some things just a little bit so you can see a little better how these boxes look. I'm going to give the H1 and H2 a different border color, just so it's a little more obvious. I'm going to make them red. Save it. Come over here and refresh it. And you can see that my headings now have red borders. That more clearly defines where this box is. So each one of these things has their own box. Well, let's look at what the box model is. The box model says that every single element has a box around it, and that box has these qualities. It's got content. Content is going to be all that stuff that we put in our web page, the text, the images, all that kind of stuff. Around the content, there's going to be this space called padding. Padding is the space in between the content and the edge of the box. Let's illustrate how padding works. I'm going to put some padding on my H1s and H2s. I'm going to put 2% padding on them. I'll save it, go over to the browser, and my H1s and H2s, just watch them when I refresh, right there and right there. I'll refresh. Boom. I've got some extra space now around the content. It pushed the edge of the box, or this border, away from the content, so you've got a little bit of space, a little bit of breathing room. That's padding. Let's take a look at margin. Margin is the space between the edge of the box and other elements. So it's the space outside of the box. This allows us to push other things away from the edges of the edge of a box. I'm going to put some margin around these. I'm going to go something kind of big so it's obvious. 10%. Save it. Come over here and refresh it. Wow, that's a big space. I put a huge space between the edge of my H1 and H2 headers and the edges of their boxes. It pushed the edges of the boxes away from or pushed other content away from the edges of the box that I applied that margin to. So I've got padding inside the box, and I've got margin outside of the box. All right? So that's padding and margin. We've taken a look at border just a little bit, but border is the line that goes around the edge of the box. We don't have to have borders on everything. I'm going to take all these borders off, refresh it, and you'll just see now I've got borders on my headings, on my H1s and H2s. How do we set the border? Well, the border can be set with one line like this, the border property. And there are three values that we associate with it: the width of the border, the style of the border, and the color of the border. When you set this property all in one line and all in one declaration like this, you have to do it in a very specific order. And each of these properties have to be there. You have to go width, style, color, in that order. If you don't do it in that order, if you're missing one, things might not show up the way you want them to. For example, if I miss the width, the border is going to default to a default width. It's red and it's solid, but it's not the width that I wanted. Okay? If I don't add a color, it's going to go to a default, which is black. Okay? It's not necessarily what I want. I wanted red. So you got to put these in there and put them in that order. I have a little mantra whenever I'm doing borders with one declaration. I think 2 pixels solid black, 2 pixels solid black, 2 pixels solid black. And I just type that out. I go 2 pixels solid black. Check it, make sure it shows up. Yup, it showed up. Then I go back and modify it however I want to. Maybe I want these borders to be 5 pixels double orange. That's hideous. Still going to do it. There we go. We've got 5 pixels solid orange border around these things. But as long as you remember that order, 2 pixels solid black, you can come back and change these values to whatever you want. Borders have to have an absolute unit for the width. In other words, you have to use something like pixels. You can't use percentages. 2%? Nope, that doesn't work. Can't do it. You have to use an absolute. You've got to use pixels. This makes things problematic, and we're going to get into why that's problematic in future episodes. But just so you know, using borders can make positioning things sometimes rather difficult because you're going to end up mixing relative units, percents, and ems and things like that with absolute units of pixels, and that can get a little bit messy. So we'll talk about that in the future, but what I'm going to say right now, one, from a design standpoint, use borders sparingly, because once you start putting a lot of borders in here, you start getting what I call Boxitis. I'll show you what I mean. Boxitis looks like this. Two pixels solid black on the border of all paragraphs. Now, every time there's a paragraph, there's going to be a box around it. Let's imagine that you're reading a novel. You're reading a long novel. It's about 1,000 pages, lots of text. And every time you come to the end of a paragraph, there's a line. It breaks the flow of your reading. That line visually stops. It stops your eye and prevents you from moving on to the next thing. It creates a lot of visual noise. In fact, it's kind of exhausting on the eyes. I think if there's one basic design rule that you should follow, any good web designer should follow, don't put borders around paragraphs. Just don't do it. Don't do select paragraph and put borders or even background color or both. Because you get Boxitis. You get a bunch of boxes everywhere. Things get visually just too exciting. They get there's too much stuff going on, and it makes it very hard to read. It breaks up the flow of my document. If you want to add background colors or borders in, maybe put the borders around articles so that you read through an entire article and then you see that visual stop. That border creates a visual cue that says this section is now done. But don't put borders around all the paragraphs. I see it all the time from people who are learning how to do this, but I would avoid doing it. All right, that's a little bit much about borders, but it's something that I'm kind of passionate about. Don't do what I just did. All right, that's the border. Back to the box model. Box model has your content. It's surrounded by a box. That box can have padding and margin and border. These things allow us to shift things around in the document a little bit. Now we also have a couple dimensions that we haven't talked about yet. We've got height and width. All boxes have a height and width. I'm going to first talk about setting the width. I'm going to set the width on my H1s and H2s. I'm going to set it to 50%. Come over here, you can see it takes up all usable space right now. Go down to 50%, and now it's taking up 50% of its usable space. You might say, this goes more than halfway across. Well, from border to border, it's taking up 50%, but then I've got these 10% margins on either side. So this is 60% of the browser from edge of margin to the other edge of the border. All right? The whole box itself is 10% here, 50% here, and 10% here. So if I had another element sitting over here, it would have to be less than 30% to sit next to it. Okay? So now this box with the margins and its width takes up a total of 70%. All right? The box itself takes up 50%. The margins are an extra 20. That's width. You see my H2s and H1s both have a set width. I'm going to set the width on my articles. Now I'm going to first start with header. Okay, I'll set the width on the header. I'm going to set the width on the header to 50%. The header is going to take up 50% of its usable space. So right now my header is stretching from edge to edge of browser to edge of browser. I'm going to refresh it, and hey, wait, my H1 just shrunk down. Well, let's put a border on the header so you can see what's really going on here. 2 pixels, double black, making it black so it differentiates itself from the heading. There we go. You can see now that this header is taking up 50% the width of the browser. And we've got this little guy in here, the H1, is taking up 50% of its usable space. I'm going to get rid of the margin and padding really quickly on my H1s and H2s, just so it's a little bit more visible here. Now you can see clearly my H1 is taking up half the width of my header. If I make my header wider, you're going to see that that H1 is going to grow. Width defines the width of an element based on its usable space. So if I do a percentage, 70% for example, it's going to take up 70% of the usable space. In other words, the header is inside of body. Header is going to take up 75% the width of the body. See that? And then my H1 grew because my H1 is taking up 50% of usable space. I'm going to set my H1 to 75% width. And it's going to take up 75% of the usable space of the header. So it's going to come over to here, roughly. See that? I was right. Right about there. Does this make sense? Width controls the width of an element. Oftentimes when we work with widths in this class, you are going to set them as relative values, like percentages. You can set them to absolute values. For example, I could say the width of the header is going to be 960 pixels. There we go. And my H1 is going to be a relative. It's going to take up 75% of the usable space here. Okay, so I can set them to relatives, and as I grow and shrink the browser, that header still stays the same width. That makes for a very stable composition. The philosophy that I'm going to take in this course for the most part is going to be to make fluid designs. So we're going to use relative units almost exclusively. So instead of doing 960 pixels, I might do something like this, 90%. Now it's going to stretch to 90% the width of the browser, and my H1 will take up 75% the width of the header. All right, that's widths. I'm going to spend considerably less time on height, and here's why. Height is problematic. I'm going to put some borders back on articles, just so we can see the edges of the articles. I'm going to make the borders on the articles green. There, now you can see those borders have shown up. I'm going to set the height on my articles. I'm going to set the height on the articles all to 250 pixels. Save it. Refresh it. Oops. Sometimes I make mistakes. We all do, especially when I'm moving fast. I have to put height here, 250 px. Now I'll refresh it. There we go. Wow, all of my articles are now shrunk down to be really small. And what's happening here, they're 250 pixels high, but the content that's going in those articles is longer than 250 pixels. So what you've got going on is the content is breaking out of the bounds of their boxes. This is bad. This will happen almost any time you set the height to an absolute value on an element. I would avoid setting the height on an element unless you absolutely need to, and you know for sure the height of the content that's going in it. Otherwise, just avoid doing it altogether, because what's going to happen is you're going to have content breaking out of the bottom of the boxes, and that's bad. Can I set it to a percentage, maybe 250%? Let's see what happens. Well, that doesn't work. It doesn't recognize a percentage. What it did is it just snapped to the defaults, to regular flow. The height of a box is always going to collapse to contain the right amount of content. So you can see that this article here stops right down here below the bottom paragraph. It didn't go out to 250% the size. Well, why is that? Well, let's think about this. The browser, these relative units are based on having a clear knowledge of the size of the browser. The web page, the HTML, can know the width of the browser. It's got a defined width. From left to right side, the browser is going to inform the HTML how wide it actually is. So we have that information. But the height of a browser is undefined. It goes on indefinitely. In other words, it goes on forever and ever and ever. You can't take a percentage of an undefined value. In order to get a percentage, you need a defined value. We need to know how tall something is to take a percentage of it. So we can't set a relative height. Heights are problematic. I would avoid using them if at all possible. Only use them when you think it's absolutely necessary. And for the most part, it's probably going to be totally unnecessary in this course. All right, so that's the height. I'm just going to take that out of there because we're not really going to use it. That's probably the last time I'm going to address it in this course entirely. You know it's there. You know it's available to you. Just use it only when necessary. If you see content breaking out of the bottom of a box, it's because you probably set the height. Take that height off of there. All right, so that is the box model. In review, the box model is going to be the idea that every single element or every single piece of content that you put in an element is going to be a box surrounding it. And that box is going to have space in between the content and the edge of the box, which is padding, from the edge of the box out to other boxes, which is margin. It's going to have height and width, and it's going to have a border. And you can use those to control how that content will display in the browser. In future videos, we're going to use this box model to create some more complex and very interesting layouts. Thanks for watching.